The U.S. Mexico border is one of the most significant, politically charged, and heavily debated borders in the world. It stretches over 1,954 miles or 3,145 kilometers, cutting across 4 U.S. states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and 6 Mexican states, Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. The history of this border is filled with conflict, negotiation, economic interdependence, and cultural exchange. The current situation continues to evoke intense debate over immigration, border security, drug trafficking, and human rights. Understanding the U.S.-Mexico border requires a historical lens and an analysis of the contemporary political and social challenges that both nations face. Historical background. The origins of the U.S.-Mexico border can be traced back to the early 19th century, during a period of westward expansion by the United States. In 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain, controlling a vast territory that included modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The U.S. coveted this land as part of its Manifest Destiny doctrine, which justified American territorial expansion. Tensions grew between the U.S. and Mexico, particularly over Texas. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico, and the U.S. annexed it in 1845. This move led to the Mexican-American War, 1846–1848, a conflict that would dramatically alter the map of North America. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ended the war and forced Mexico to cede about half of its territory to the U.S., including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of other western states. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, a sum that, while seemingly substantial at the time, was a fraction of the land's actual value. The treaty also established the first official U.S.-Mexico border. This new boundary, stretching from the Rio Grande to the Pacific Ocean, was largely unregulated in the early years. People crossed freely between the two nations for trade, work, and social reasons. In fact, many communities in the border region shared cultural ties, with intermarriages and bilingualism being common. Early 20th century developments. The early 20th century brought significant changes to the border. The Mexican Revolution, 1910–1920, prompted many Mexicans to flee violence and poverty, leading to a wave of immigration into the U.S. simultaneously. The U.S. was undergoing its own economic changes, with the rise of industries in need of labor. Mexican immigrants became an essential part of the American workforce, particularly in agriculture, railroads, and mining. However, the U.S. also began implementing more restrictions on immigration during this time. The 1924 Immigration Act created the U.S. Border Patrol, whose primary role was to prevent illegal entry into the country, although the focus was initially more on Asian immigration. By the 1930s, amidst the Great Depression, anti-Mexican sentiment grew in the U.S., leading to the repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants, many of whom were U.S. citizens. Post-World War II period and Bracero Program. After World War II, the U.S. and Mexico entered into a more cooperative relationship, especially concerning labor. The Bracero Program, 1942–1964, allowed millions of Mexican workers to legally enter the U.S. on temporary work visas, primarily to fill labor shortages in agriculture. While the program addressed the need for cheap labor, it also highlighted the exploitation many Mexican workers faced, as they were often underpaid and subjected to poor working conditions. The end of the Bracero Program led to an increase in unauthorized immigration. Mexican workers who had been reliant on the program continued to seek work in the U.S., leading to the rise of undocumented immigration. The U.S. government responded with stricter immigration laws and deportation efforts, such as Operation Wetback in 1954, which forcibly removed hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants from the U.S. Late 20th century, NAFTA and the militarization of the border. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994, was a turning point in U.S.-Mexico relations. NAFTA created a trilateral trade bloc between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, removing tariffs and barriers to trade. While NAFTA spurred economic growth and integration, especially along the border, it also led to economic disruption in Mexico. Many Mexican farmers were unable to compete with subsidized American agricultural products, which caused widespread job loss and increased migration to the U.S. In response to the growing number of undocumented migrants, the U.S. began to militarize the border. In 1994, the Clinton administration launched Operation Gatekeeper, which aimed to prevent illegal crossings by increasing law enforcement presence, building fences, and using surveillance technology. Similar operations, like Operation Hold the Line in Texas and Operation Safeguard in Arizona, followed. These efforts pushed migrants into more dangerous, remote areas of the desert, leading to an increase in migrant deaths. The border in the 21st century, security and migration. The September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks in the U.S. brought national security to the forefront of American politics. The U.S. Mexico border became a focal point for fears over terrorism, although there was no evidence linking the border to terrorist activities. Nonetheless, the U.S. expanded its border security apparatus, establishing the Department of Homeland Security and increasing the budget and personnel for Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Immigration reform became a polarizing issue, with debates centering on how to balance security with human rights. In the 2000s, migration patterns also began to shift. While Mexican immigration had dominated U.S. migration for much of the 20th century, more people began arriving from Central American countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. These migrants often fled violence, poverty, and political instability, seeking asylum in the U.S. The rise of drug cartels in Mexico, fueled by demand for illegal drugs in the U.S., further complicated the border situation. Cartels took control of smuggling routes, trafficking drugs and people across the border. Violence in Mexican border cities like Ciudad Juárez and Tijuana skyrocketed, with thousands of people losing their lives in the crossfire. The Trump era and the border wall debate. The border became a central issue in U.S. politics during the presidency of Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021. Trump campaigned on the promise of building a big, beautiful wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to stop illegal immigration. His administration enacted a series of controversial immigration policies, including family separation at the border, the construction of additional border wall sections, and the Remain in Mexico policy, which required asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while their claims were processed in the U.S. Trump's policies were polarizing, with supporters arguing that they were necessary to protect national security, and critics decrying them as inhumane and ineffective. The border wall became a symbol of the broader debate over immigration, with some viewing it as a necessary measure for sovereignty and others seeing it as a violation of human rights. Current situation, challenges and complexities. As of 2024, the U.S.-Mexico border remains a contentious and complex issue. While the Biden administration has taken steps to reverse some of Trump's policies, including halting construction on the border wall and ending family separation, challenges persist. The number of migrants attempting to cross the border has surged, driven by ongoing instability in Central America, economic hardship, and the impacts of climate change. Many of these migrants seek asylum, but the U.S. asylum system is overwhelmed, leading to long wait times and inadequate resources for processing claims. The border region is also grappling with other issues, such as the environmental impact of border security infrastructure, the treatment of migrant children, and the role of private detention centers. Additionally, the economic interdependence of the U.S. and Mexico remains strong, with millions of people crossing the border legally every year for work, trade, and tourism. The U.S.-Mexico border is far more than just a physical boundary. It is a complex and dynamic space that reflects the deep economic, social, and political ties between the two nations. Its history is marked by conflict and cooperation, and its future remains uncertain as both countries continue to navigate the challenges of immigration, security, and human rights. The debate over how to manage the border will likely persist for years to come, as it remains one of the most visible symbols of the broader issues facing both the US and Mexico. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.